Good afternoon, good morning to all of you, whatever the case might be. I hope you're doing well, staying healthy, and reasonably happy. I'm going to start talking today about Romanticism. This will be the first of three lecture videos devoted to that. Style, yes, but Romanticism is bigger than that. Romanticism is really a cultural movement. It's a whole shift in attitude toward the world and the place of the human being in the world. Romanticism has its roots in the late 18th century in writings such as those by Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France. A number of German philosophers contributed to the origins of Romanticism as well. And as your textbook underscores, the notion of freedom, freedom as the appropriate state for a human being, for human life, is really fundamental to Romanticism. And freedom here is understood not just political freedom, but freedom of thought, freedom of religion, freedom of action, freedom of taste. And so we see a shift away from the notion of universal ideals, such as are expressed David in a painting like the Oath of the Rati, the idea that it is noble of an individual to place the Commonwealth and the interests of the Commonwealth above their personal interests. That's the central idea of the painting. We see a shift away from that to individual perceptions, individual feelings especially, a shift away from reason to emotion. And this leads people of the time to value things like individual visions, dreams, nightmares, even fantasies, those things that that we experience personally and quite intensely, as well as things outside of ourselves which are stimulating to the imagination, such as faraway places, other cultures, exotic things. In the practice of art, it leads not to a single new style, but to a diversity of styles. That's the outcome of an emphasis placed on individual experience, individual action. And so we're going to look at artists in Spain, in France, in England, and we're going to see that in Germany as well, and also in the United States. And we're going to see that within these works, that style ranges quite broadly from art that is precise and highly illusionistic to art that is more free and more given over to color and a kind of sketchy technique, a painterly technique. Let's shift to some works of art. I'm going to first show you a work from France that is in the chapter or in the section of the textbook devoted to Napoleon and his patronage of the arts and the celebration of Napoleon in works of art. This is by Antoine-Jean Gros, and it's entitled Napoleon in the Pest House at Jaffa, or in the textbook it's given Napoleon visiting the plague-stricken in Jaffa. Now the artist here, Gros, was one of David's many students. So his training, his roots are in the classical tradition. But in this work, we see him deviating from the way an artist in that tradition would paint such a subject in some significant ways. First, the subject. Napoleon led a military campaign through the Middle East. And in passing through what's modern-day Israel, Palestine may be the appropriate term of the time, his army encountered an outbreak of the plague in the city of Jaffa, Haifa, and the plague struck both local citizenry, but also members of the army. And an Islamic mosque was utilized as a place of quarantine. All this will sound too familiar to us, to you, um, and that's the setting for this particular painting. Um, Napoleon is here shown paying a visit to the plague house, and and he's shown reaching out to touch the sores of one of the plague, one of the victims of the plague, in a way that suggests that he himself is impervious to disease, or has a kind of courage that makes him superhuman. To show Napoleon this way plays on an old French tradition that French kings could heal by touching the disease. And you'll notice that on the left-hand side of the painting, these are Muslim doctors who look disconsolate at their inability to relieve the suffering of the plague victims. At least one of the army officers around Napoleon holds his handkerchief to his nose to escape the stench of the place. But Napoleon is oblivious to these things and boldly, courageously reaches out to touch this plague victim. Across the foreground, there are a number of dead and dying. And we might call this motif a threshold of pathos. A classical painter like David, would suppress such unseemly details, such hideous details. But we're going to find that in the Romantic tradition, in the Romantic style, that extremes of human experience, suffering, death, physical decline, these things are shown quite vividly. And I say a threshold because these figures are placed right across the foreground of the painting, and to look further into the space of the painting, our gaze has to pass across them. You'll notice that the setting here is exotic. We see the curious, the interesting, intriguing details of a faraway place, pointed arches, a minaret in the distance. There are arches of horseshoe shape, a motif that one sees often in Islamic mosques. An elaborate decorative motifs along the enclosure of a courtyard that would precede the mosque itself and be a place of preparation prior to entry into the mosque. The palette here is a rich kind of heated palette of gold and red colors. Now it's said that in fact Napoleon entered the mosque in order to enter the quarantine area in order to gauge whether to leave members of his army behind or to take them with him. In other words, his interest was more practical, logistical, and yet that's not what's shown here. This is a kind of propaganda piece that makes Napoleon look like a great sympathetic leader. And by the way, this was exhibited publicly in Paris with the idea of conveying that message to the viewers that would see it. Let me back up here. So if we compare the two paintings, you can see again, the simplicity, the clarity, the basic symmetry of David's painting with the idealized figures of the Horatii men and their father. But notice there are some similarities in the use of the arches as a structural motif separating the figures in David's painting into very clear figural groups. We see that same motif of three arches with Napoleon located in the center. But I would say that the structure of the entire painting is not nearly so clear, so simple, so pared down to basic essentials as is the David composition. We're going to devote most of our attention today to the artist Goya, Francisco Goya, one of the great artists in the history of Spanish art, who lived a long life between 1746 and 1828. So if you look at those dates and think of what happened during those years, those were the years of the rise of Napoleon and the Napoleonic Wars across Europe, um, and the French occupation of Napoleonic troops of Spain during the years um, roughly 1801 to 1808. Um, Goya was apprenticed at age 13 to a local painter, and then at 17 he departed his hometown of Fuente Todos for Madrid to study at the Academy of San Fernando with Francisco Bayeux. Um, Between 1768 and 1771, that is for 3 years, Goya visited Rome at his own expense. Though what he did there and what he might have been interested in is largely unknown, and Italian art seems to have left rather little influence on him. Soon after his return to Spain, he began designing tapestry cartoons, that is, designs for tapestries, which were, of course, woven by tapestry makers. And he owed this work to Francisco Bayeux, his earlier teacher, who had become his father-in-law with Goya's marriage to Bayeux's daughter. Goya produced many, many tapestry cartoons, on many of them on genre subjects from daily life. But he also began taking on the painting of portraits of high-ranking aristocrats and government officials. And so I'm showing you one of these here in the person of the Conde de Floridablanca. You can see that name down here, the Count Conde of Floridablanca. White flower is the way that would translate. And this is a portrait that dates from 1783. So this is in the tradition of full-length aristocratic and monarchical portraiture. The work is 8.5 feet high by 5.5 feet wide. We see the full standing figure of the Conde, and he seems to be looking into a mirror, as Goya himself, depicted in the foreground, presents a painting to him. We might imagine that it's a portrait, because the Conde looks as if he might be looking into the mirror and comparing his own image as it appears there, his reflection as it appears there, with the representation of him in the painting that's presented to him by Goya. He is, of course, elaborately attired, richly attired in colors that bring a visual focus to him within this otherwise rather dark painting. He's shown at work in his study. Drawings, these are architectural drawings for a building of some kind, are presented to him, perhaps for his approval. There's an assistant in the background. Here is a gilt and large, impressive clock. And then hanging above him is a medallion portrait of the king, King Carlo III. And he would be, of course, the monarch that the Conde serves, and within whose regime the Conde has position of importance. Notice that Goya is closer to us, but he has depicted himself as much smaller in size, in order, of course, to emphasize the greater stature socially and not just physically of the Conde de Floridablanca. At the same time that Goya was seeking commissions of this kind and becoming more and more widely known as a competent and even very proficient portrait painter, his attention was engaged in other ways. And we're looking at a work here that dates from 1793 called Attack on a Coach. This is probably influenced by Goya's own emotional and physical state, because in 1791, a severe illness left Goya deaf. During his convalescence, he painted a number of small pictures like this, which seemed to be the first of his many purely personal statements intended to explore subjects for which there was normally no opportunity in commissioned work. So this is a small work. It would be about 18 inches in height. It's made of oil on a tin plate. And as the title indicates, what this shows is a coach that was traveling along a road in the countryside. It looks like in rather remote terrain, stopped by highwaymen, and these robbers will take whatever's of value here, and they seem intent on slaying the occupants of the coach without without feeling any guilt or sorrow in doing this. We see dead bodies on the ground, and here's a man praying for his life, while the highwaymen, well, one of them aims a gun at him, and another sits nonchalantly on the coach. So it's a painting about human brutality, um, the total lack of feeling that some humans can have for others, and we're going to see this feeling, this exploration of the dark sides of humanity emerge more and more in Goya's art. Goya was also a great printmaker, and he made a couple series of prints. These were really independent projects. They were not commissioned by anyone, but images that allowed him to explore his own interests and to comment on on societal conventions. This image we see on the screen is from his first important series of prints, which consisted of 80 etchings in aquatints. It was published in 1799. Goya would likely have known the satirical prints that had been made in previous decades by English artists such as Hogarth and Rowlandson on contemporary political life. But in Spain, Goya could not take the risk of criticizing the Spanish monarch, his employer by this time. Goya was a painter to the king. And so he directed his attention and his satirical point of view at social life, social behavior and attitudes, which may implicitly comment on Spanish political life. He put an advertisement in a Madrid paper for this print series, which read like this: "Since the artist is convinced that the censure of human errors and vices, though they may seem the province of eloquence and poetry, may also be the object of painting, he has chosen as subjects adequate for his work from the multitude of follies and blunders common in every civil society, as well as from the vulgar prejudices and lies authorized by custom, ignorance, or interest, those that he has thought most suitable matter for ridicule." So he's looking at the way people treat each other, their prejudices, the lies that we maintain, the follies, the blunders in our behavior. The image that you see here on the screen was number 43 in this series, which was called Caprichos. Or we would translate that as caprices. And a caprice is an imaginative thought or image or idea, something that springs from the imagination. This particular image is entitled "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." You can see that title down here, "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." The medium here is etching and aquatint. And aquatint is the technique that allows for these intermediate values, not just light and dark, but also a variety of gray tones. Well, what's going on here is that a male figure has fallen asleep, and we might imagine he is a writer or perhaps an artist. Notice that there is paper in front of him as well as drawing instruments, writing instruments. And because he's fallen asleep, or as he falls asleep, these monstrous creatures, include owls and bats, rise up into the air around him. Now, this might be interpreted in a number of ways. Your textbook suggests these interpretations. One being that when reason is absent, when reason takes a back seat, then the thoughts, the the ideas that spring from our imagination are given freedom to to um, to emerge, and this is a good thing. We maybe discover new things, or uh, we gain new ways of looking at the world around us. Um, Looked at more negatively, one might interpret this as saying that uh, when when reason falls asleep, when reason loses control over us and the world around us, then all kinds of bad things can emerge and have their way with the world. A lot of these images are open to interpretation, but nonetheless, they're provocative. They make us think. And that's true of this image as well from the series. Um, the, um, the title of this is, um, is translated as "If the Pitcher is Broken." And what we see is a mother who has been interrupted in her hanging of laundry, uh, pounding the rear end of her child because apparently he has broken the pitcher that lies here in the foreground. Notice again the aquatint and etching medium, which allows for a variety of gray tones as well as light and dark. We're seeing the actual color of the paper here in these white areas. And you'll notice also the sketchy technique of Goya, which is most visible perhaps in the face and the details given to the drapery. Now, what does this mean? There are a number of ways of interpreting this as well, but they all have something to do with the fact that the boy is being beaten, it seems, mercilessly, and one wonders if the infraction warrants such a beating. Yeah, the son is mischievous, but the mother is angry, and which is worse? Goya's position in the royal court rose during his lifetime from being one of the several painters to the king to that of first painter to the king. And in that role, he was expected to do the kind of things that Velázquez had done for Philip IV more than a century before. That is, paint portraits of members of the royal family and also historical works that would glorify the accomplishments of the Spanish uh, royal family and government. And in that role, he painted the big portrait that you see on the screen here, the family of Charles IV. This dates from 1800. The work is 9 feet in height by 11 feet in width. The 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 arrangement of the imagery here might look familiar to you. There are paintings on the back wall. We see a group of people scattered here across the foreground or middle ground. They're somewhat in the distance. But notice that there is an easel over here. I'm not an easel, but a stretched painting of large size. And this is Goya, dimly visible in the shadows standing behind it. All this, of course, is reminiscent of, as you see on the right-hand side, Las Meninas by Velázquez, a similar group of a cluster of figures, paintings in the back wall parallel to the picture plane, and a large stretched canvas with the painter active behind it. So on the one hand, Goya is paying homage to his great predecessor. But if we take a look at the royal family, we see the queen standing surprisingly in the center and surrounded by a couple of young children. She is separate from the clustered figures on each side of her and has greater prominence. This is Charles IV here. Their eldest son, Ferdinando VII, is over here, and then other members of the family are grouped around. Notice that they are bedecked with medals and sashes and richly decorated clothing. If we go in, you can see some of this more closely. And yet, they themselves don't look particularly noble. They're not standing in proud contrapposto, or perhaps they're standing contrapposto, but not very proudly, not very confidently. They exude little in the way of noble bearing. We have a young woman over here who holds a child in a way that looks naturalistic and yet not very flattering to her. Um, there's an elder member of the family back here with big staring eyes. It's been said they look like the baker's family or the corner grocer's family that's just won the lottery prize. And they go out and spend their money on fancy clothing, which they wear, and yet it hardly seems to fit them or to appropriate to who they are as people. Um, in subtle ways, it seems that, or maybe not so subtle, that Goya is satirizing the royal family, um, suggesting here that, in fact, the queen is the stronger member of this couple, which was in fact the case. Um, but for all we know, um, the royal family found the work quite acceptable, and um, and that any satire here, any criticism of them, um, was was not perceived by them. Uh, the setup here implies that they're looking into a mirror, and that Goya is painting what he sees in the mirror. The mirror, of course, would serve the purpose of flattening out this complex arrangement of figures and rendering that arrangement as an image which he could then copy onto the canvas. This was a common technique of the time. Charles IV quite soon fell from power with an invasion of Napoleonic troops into Spain. And what's called the Peninsular War ensued. And this was a brutal period of suppression of the Spanish people in all kinds of ways, who responded in fighting a guerrilla war, a term that means little war. They were their resources were inadequate to confront French troops directly, and so they would attack when the edges of the troop, when they were least expected, when it might be nighttime, when the French were most vulnerable, and the French would inevitably then respond brutally and try to suppress these Spanish efforts to regain control. With the fall of Napoleon, the French troops were eventually pushed out of Spain. Ferdinand came to power, and in 1814, Goya received a commission from the monarchy to paint two works of art that commemorated a Spanish resistance to the French, um, and, um, and Spanish people as really martyrs to the suppression of the Spanish by the French army. So the first of these paintings is called, it took place on the 3rd of May, and it's the uprising on a particular hill in Madrid. I'm sorry, the 2nd of May. And what you're looking at here is the 3rd of May, 1808, at Madrid. So this is the aftermath of the uprising. This is the suppression of the brutal suppression of the Spanish by French troops. This is a large painting, 8.5 feet by a little over 11 feet. And it depicts war in a way that we haven't seen before. It depicts war in a way that's really quite novel in the history of art. And so I want to bring up an earlier painting that you should remember, you should know, to compare with this Goya work. We're looking on the right-hand side of Velázquez's painting of the surrender at Breda. And human mistreatment of one another, as inevitably happens in war, is not shown. You recall that what's shown here is this moment of surrender, when the Spanish commander gets off his horse and receives the key to the city that he's held under siege, and behaves in a magnanimous, generous way toward the defeated commander. So that the painting, it conveys both Spanish military superiority and Spanish moral goodness. Now, in contrast, Goya shows us here in the 3rd of May the this a brutal encounter between French troops who are shown here on the right-hand side, lined up in a firing squad, and they're executing anybody suspected of complicity in the uprising the previous day. They're doing this where it would get the least attention under the cover of night. Notice that their faces are not shown, so they're shown as they're dehumanized by Goya. They're shown as inhumane, cruel, killing machines bent over their rifles and going about this grisly business without feeling. At this moment, they're executing a man who wears a white shirt, and so attention is drawn to him by that color choice. His hands are outstretched in a way that suggests Christ on the cross. He's strongly lit. And you'll see that there are 2 references here to the church. There's a monk in the foreground, a Franciscan monk, who has his hands held in prayer. And he, along with the tower in the distance here over a church building, suggests that the church, for all of its standing in the world, all of its stature, all of its influence, was incapable of stopping this killing. So there's implicit criticism of the church. We've got dead bodies on the ground, lots of blood visible, again, a kind of threshold of pathos. And then there are other future victims lined up in a way that suggests that this killing will go on and on and on. In sum, then, we've got a painting that shows war as not the kind of human experience that brings out the best in people, noble behavior, courage, fortitude, bravery, and the like, but rather leads to savage behavior and mistreatment of humans by others. And so, as I said, this is a whole different way, a radically new way of looking at war and in its the consequences, the outcomes that it brings to human experience. One last work here by Goya. During his years as court painter to the king, Goya was able to acquire a country property, a small villa outside Madrid. And in the years that followed, years of conflict and misery in Spain, he painted works directly on the walls of his villa that express his bleak outlook toward the future of the world. He's giving free rein to his inner emotions, in keeping with the very nature of Romanticism, in responding to the events and the circumstances that were unfolding around him. So this work is entitled Saturn Devouring His Children. Goya painted this on the walls of his own dining room. Imagine that. So if you had been a dinner guest or had stopped by for a drink, you might have to look at this as you took in your food and drink or conversed with Goya. It dates from 1820 to 1823, painted directly on the wall. It was later transferred to canvas, and it's now in Madrid. Now, the subject here, of course, comes from mythology. And you have seen this subject before as a detail in another painting, but you probably don't remember it, so I want to show it to you here. Here on the right-hand side is a detail from the Cortona ceiling in the Palazzo Barberini in Rome, depicting the triumph of the Barberini. And you recall that in that painting, divine providence, shown here, embodied here in this female figure, a personification, she indicates that the Barbarinis should receive this crown of stars, the crown of immortality, as a fitting reward for their accomplishments. And you recall that above this is the Barberini coat of arms, and there are two other crowns, the papal crown and also a crown of laurel leaves. Down below uh, is the figure Saturn again, and Saturn is also devouring one of his children, as we see in the Goya painting. But you'll notice that Saturn is shown here as a robust, muscular man, similarly bearded, and he's got the arm of one of his children in his mouth in a way that seems really rather benign, rather innocent. This has to do with the myth that Saturn learned that one of his children would rise up and usurp his power, and to prevent that from happening, he consumed his children. Well, Goya's depiction of this subject is radically different. Saturn is shown not as a robust, athletic, muscular, heroic figure, but rather as a gaunt, bony figure. And you'll notice that he is shown as a series of diagonals conveying instability in the way we perceive them generally. He's cut off by the frame. So the fragmentation of the body and the jutting diagonal lines suggest instability. He's shown in strong light and dark contrast that are so strong they really break up the body, they fragment the body into, down here, you'll notice a highlight part of the leg and shadowy areas around that are so intensely dark that we can hardly see them. And that kind of fragmentation or blocking up, breaking up of the body appears elsewhere. The face we see is one of terror, large staring eyes, mouth wide open, and there's nothing benign about the way he's chewing on his child here. The head is already gone, and the blood suggests the way an animal might eat his prey. The background is entirely black, dark of night. So Goya here is giving free rein to his bleak attitude toward the future of humanity. We might interpret this painting symbolically. If parents eat their children, then there is no future. Humanity will die. Humanity will not flourish, will not go on, and so this is a kind of reversal of the way we expect parents to treat their children, not nurturing them, but destroying them. I'm afraid on that bleak note I've got to end, but we will be back to talk about French Baroque art, Romantic art, in the works of Géricault and Delacroix and in landscape paintings after that.